Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel and thanks for logging on. Today we're discussing the Omega Constellation Globemaster annual calendar. You can see this 41mm stainless steel and tungsten annual calendar on our website. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you enjoy these videos, and please click on the card in the upper right hand corner of the screen at any time during this video to see our full sales listing for this watch with additional accessories included in the sale, high resolution images for your desktop, and naturally complete pricing details for this 2016 Basel World debut. And indeed, I was at Basel World the year this watch launched, and we created quite a stir. Coming only 12 months after the well-received Constellation Globemaster family debuted, the annual calendar made a meaningful upgrade to the underlying movement with a useful complication that requires resetting only once per year when the month changes from February to March. So it's an annual calendar, it's a master chronometer, it's a combination of two different metals in two subtly different tones, and it wears easily on my small wrist. My wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference, and you can see I'm having no difficulty with the 41mm case. Although it's not a thin watch, it doesn't wear thick. 14.9 millimeters, you will get caught up on the toughest of, for example, French cuffs or exotic sleeves because of the slight cantilever of the bezel, but because it is on the wrist a little bit lower than its thickness suggests, it does nestle down on the wrist. You will find that it easily fits underneath a jacket sleeve of any kind, whether a blazer, a sport jacket, or a dress jacket. The watch is relatively compact lug-to-lug, and this is where it becomes a very wearable option for smaller wrists, as it measures exactly 49.9 millimeters from lug-to-lug across the wrist. I often like to say that if your wrist is small, that is about 14 centimeters to 16.5 centimeters in circumference, you want to keep your lug-to-lug dimension, and this is a little bit dependent on shape, but in general the rule of thumb is 50 millimeters or less, or under. And you'll find that this watch wears easily on my wrist, partially because it's underneath that critical threshold, and partially because the lugs themselves are rather stubby. The only fight the watch is going to give you on a smaller wrist is by virtue of the fact that the strap nicely conforms to the end of the case, and it creates a very integrated look, little daylight between case and strap, but it does have a bit of a tendency to flare. As you can see, it does want to arc out over the edges of your wrist, but it will look fine because the only problem you have aesthetically with a watch is when the lugs themselves physically flare out, and this will not do that to you. You'll also note that it is an unusual choice of exceptionally light, almost honey brown, on a large rectangular scale alligator with a little bit of a flare. You can see how it swells to match the shape of the lug and profile. It is a handsome strap. Also with a contrasting stitch that's slightly off-white and joined with Omega's now ubiquitous deployant clasp. Satin finished on its tops, polished on its edges. It is a twin trigger release system, and you'll see as I depress the triggers, this is the only way to open it, by depressing the triggers and unlocking. It's not friction fit, it can't accidentally pop open, and Omega doesn't resort to a cheap clamshell lock. You'll also note that it has a minderless system, so excess strap length is tucked underneath the body of the clasp, so there's no need for minder loops, and when the watch is sized, there's no excess strap flapping around. Now the dial is simplicity itself, albeit with one elaboration. It's a faithful recreation of the 1952 Pie-Pan constellation, with the exception that, like the Rolex Skydweller, the 12 hours have been used as surrogates for the months of the year. So you have this needle-style or baton radial indicator that jumps between the indices, and each space between the indices represents 1 month of the year. So you have your date, you have your month, and the date and the month correspond every day of the year except during the jump from February to March. So it's an annual calendar, and the dial itself is part of the display. Now moving back out to the case for a moment, because I know you're going to want a little bit more information. The finish is handsome, and it doesn't feel like it's derivative of any other Omega. It's nothing like the Griffin Claw constellations, the post-1982 Manhattan design as it's called, and it's nothing like the bevels of the Omega Seamaster and Speedmasters. Those tend to have cases with satin finish on the flank and enormous flared polished bevels. These are a little bit more geometric in their form. The watch has a little bit of late 60s, early 70s cushion case design DNA in it. You'll also note that the bevels contribute to a sharpness or a sort of geometric harshness about the terminus of the lugs, whereas the Speedmasters and the Seamasters tend to be a little bit more bosomy, flowing, and rounded. This one has a little bit more of a masculine hard edge. The finish between the lugs is vertical satin grain, There is horizontal satin grain on the flanks, and there's a linear satin grain on the lug hoods. You'll also note that there is a subtle difference in the color of the gray tungsten carbide bezel and the silver steel of the case profile. The tungsten carbide bezel has a very fine, and I would almost say relative to a Rolex fluting, it's almost like it's 1/2 or 1/3 the spacing. So it's much finer, a little bit more, I would say, gem-like in its faceting, because the individual planes and surfaces are so small. So they have a little bit of the quality of faceted gems, but also of a sunburst dial, in that rings of light tend to dance around this bezel in ways that you tend to see on sunburst dials, and you don't see so much on the larger facets of Rolex precious metal bezels, and that's a key distinction. Here we're talking about fluting on tungsten carbide. You're only going to see this treatment on Rolex when you're looking at some kind of a gold. Now, the dial itself features an opaline or lightly frosted finish. It's a matte metallic. Some might say it has a slight pebbly grain about it, and it is faceted, so it does have the appearance of a little bit of an inverted pie pan, like that first 1952 Constellation. So the center dial features a simple applied Omega marquee and company logo. All of the printing on the dial is in blue, contrasting against the silver base. The hands and indices are also blued. All indices are applied, as you can see, and there will be a loom shot at the end of the video. There's also a handsome step to the date window, which is nicely anchored at 6 o'clock. Everything along a central axis from 12 to 6 allows the dial to be split bilaterally for symmetry. It is a handsome and balanced design, and that step to the date window allows a more gradual transition from the plane of the dial to the date disc itself. Turn the watch over. The crown is not a screw down, but it is water resistant to 100 meters. And you can see the image of the observatory on the case back. Now, the first 1952 Omega Constellations featured the same image on their solid case backs, denoting the fact that back then those were observatory chronometers. Today they are master chronometers. The METAS standard, developed between Omega and the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology. It's a test of chronometric precision of the fully cased up watch, but also of water resistance, winding efficiency, power reserve, shock, and anti-magnetism. It's a much more complete and demanding test, not just of a movement like the COSC chronometer evaluations, which this watch meets, but it's a full cased up watch test, and it tests the watch in ways that customers are likely to challenge the underlying equipment. A little bit of a trial by fire, if you will, but the product in your hand and on your wrist will be that much better for it. 60-hour power reserve, twin mainspring barrels in series. You can see them both peeking out from under the barrel bridge. It does feature hacking seconds, so you can stop the seconds hand and you can synchronize precisely to a reference time by pulling the crown out 2 stops. So that's how hacking seconds works, and let me just roll through the danger zone, make sure I'm not accidentally in the midnight hour. And yeah, I was. That's why I automatically roll through if I want to operate the calendar functions of a watch, just to check. Now you pull to the intermediate position, and you actually have a double quick set function. So you have a quick set for the date, and then if you turn in the opposite direction, you have a quick set for the month. So you have a quick set function for both of the calendar indications. You can rapidly correct the watch should it run down or encounter that weird one step between February and March each year. Turning back to the case back, you can see that the watch is finished handsomely. It's machine finished, to be sure, but it's uniquely machine finished, as Omega has really embraced and run with this spiral style arabesque Côte de Genève, as they describe it, blackened screws rather than kiln fired blue or polished, a full balance bridge for the balance, and a free sprung index, the two features combining to make the watch very shock resistant. There's a hairspring Si14 Omega silicon compound that makes the watch robustly anti-magnetic, and it's over 15,000 Gauss of magnetic resistance, so we're almost into the realm of amagnetic resistance. If it can stand up in proximity to an MRI, trust me, it'll have no trouble against your refrigerator door. And finally, it does beat at the modern coaxial specific beat rate of 25,200 vibrations per hour. A little bit quirky, but that, along with the tri-level coaxial escapement, which Omega has finally mastered in the fashion envisioned by the late George Daniels, all these features come together to make the watch as accurate as Daniels originally envisioned, as precise over the long term with great stability, and requiring less maintenance over time due to the minimal friction developed and minimal lubrication required in these movements. A handsome watch with a fascinating technical specification. A versatile watch that's water resistant but equally appropriate in a suit, business suit or bathing suit. See this one and make it yours on our website. Okay, Omega Constellation Globemaster Annual Calendar. As you can see, the dial is beautifully accented in blue by day, beautifully accented in blue by night. You do lose the calendar functions, but this watch maintains its full-featured charisma and capability even in the dark. See it by the light of day on our website.